Tonight we follow the calm crime story of Jimmy Hoffa. From frozen loading docks and crowded union halls to bright hearing rooms and finally a quiet parking lot outside a suburban steakhouse. Soft tension, dry humor, no graphic detail, just a steady walk through a stubborn life that touched truckers, politicians, and a few people you would not invite to Sunday dinner. Now take a slow breath, get comfortable, and let us begin with a cardboard box of old clippings on a Detroit kitchen table in the middle of the night. Chapter 1. Night Whispers over Detroit. The city likes to pretend it sleeps, but anyone who has lived with its rhythms knows better. Long after the office lights go out, freight trains still whisper past the river, and trucks roll along the freeways, carrying other people's stories on their backs. Out beyond the bright downtown towers, the neighborhoods of Detroit breathe in a quiet, uneven way. A porch light here, a glowing window there, the far-off rumble of a semi-shifting gears. On nights like this, I sit at my small kitchen table and listen to the low sounds of the city. The refrigerator hums, the baseboard heat ticks, and somewhere outside a distant dog voices an opinion about nothing in particular. The clock on the wall insists on moving forward, one soft tick after another, as if it is counting down to something important. But the only thing waiting here is an old cardboard box on the chair beside me. The box is the color of old newspapers and coffee stains. It is full of clippings, scribbled notes, and cassette tapes with labels that have faded into pale ghosts. I have carried this box from apartment to apartment for years. People who help me move always ask what is in it. I tell them it is just paperwork from an old job. That answer is not a lie, but it is not exactly the truth either. Inside this box is a story that the city of Detroit will not let go. It is the story of a man who rose from the loading docks to the top of one of the most powerful unions in the country, and then one summer day simply drove away and never came home. A man whose last name still floats through diners, truck stops, and union halls like steam rising from a cup of coffee. Hoffa. You hear that name and you see something, even if you are not sure what the details are. Maybe you picture a short man in a dark suit, jaw set, eyes sharp. Maybe you picture a parking lot and a car that never returns. Maybe you picture a headline, years old and yellowed, that still somehow feels unfinished. For people in this city, and for a long time far beyond it, Jimmy Hoffa became less of a person and more of a question. When I was a kid, that question was the wallpaper of grown-up conversation. My parents would try to talk around it when I was in the room, but that never works with children. You give us a whisper and we will build a whole world around it. I learned early that Jimmy Hoffa was someone important, someone who had fought for working people, someone who had made powerful friends and more powerful enemies, and someone who had gone our day and not come back. At family dinners, an uncle would lean back in his chair, fork waving in a slow arc, and say that he knew a man who knew the real story. Another relative would roll their eyes and say that nobody knew anything, and that if anyone had known for sure, the newspapers would have printed it in letters big enough to read from the next county. Meanwhile, I would sit there with mashed potatoes on my plate and listen, pretending that I did not care, storing every word. The older I got, the more stories I heard. Some said Jimmy had crossed the wrong people. Others said he had refused to step aside when he was told to go quietly. A few insisted he was still alive somewhere, living under a different name, watching the news at night and muttering at how everyone had the story wrong. There was never any proof, of course, but that hardly matters when a story has settled into the bones of a city. My own life never went anywhere near as far as Hoffa's did. I worked dispatch for trucks, the kind of job where you learn the geography of a place almost by accident. I knew where the old union halls were, the warehouses with broken windows, the truck stops where night shift drivers traded gossip with tired waitresses. Every so often, somewhere between a delayed shipment and a coffee refill, someone would drift into talk about the old days, and sooner or later the name would come up again. It was almost a ritual. Someone would say that back when Hoffa ran things, you knew where you stood. Someone else would point out that the law had seen it differently. A third person would shrug and say that at least the paychecks were solid and the pensions looked real. Each of them held a small piece of the man, like they had reached into the past and pulled out one colour from a complicated painting. I listened. I have always been good at that. While others are busy arguing, I notice the way a driver's shoulders sag when he talks about losing a pension, or the way an old-timer looks out the window when he mentions a name from the past. After a while, without planning to, I started collecting their stories. A note scribbled on the back of a dispatch sheet, a clipping clipped from an old paper, now and then with a little coaxing, an interview on a cheap cassette recorder. You might think that is a strange hobby for someone who is not a detective or a historian. Maybe it is, but some nights when the radio was quiet and the trucks were already where they needed to be, I would look at the clock and feel the weight of all those unanswered questions leaning in. I could not solve them, but I could at least keep them from slipping away completely. That is how the box grew heavier. A report about a search in a New Jersey swamp, an article about a court case, a photocopied memoir page from a retired driver who swore he once shared a table with Hoffa in a hotel bar and talked about the price of coffee. Tapes where the voices crack and fade, but the words still reach across the years. None of it solves the mystery. All of it makes the man feel more real. Tonight, the box sits beside me and the city hums its sleepless lullaby outside the window. I flip open the lid and sift through the contents with slow fingers. Here is a photograph of a crowd gathered in a union hall. Men in work shirts and caps, faces lifted toward a speaker I cannot see. Here is a grainy shot of Hoffa himself, mid-stride, as if he is on his way to put out a fire only he knows about. Sometimes I pause with an item in my hand and try to imagine the exact moment it came from. The smell of cigarette smoke tangled with cheap cologne in a crowded meeting room. The hollow clack of heels on a courthouse hallway. The way a truck yard sounds just before dawn, air brakes sighing, engines waking up Pine by Urim. All those moments felt ordinary when they happened. Only later did they become pieces of a legend. The truth is, I do not know what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa. The federal agents who chased leads for decades do not know for certain either, no matter how many reports they filed. The men who were whispered about in connection with his disappearance are mostly gone now, their secrets wrapped up with them. What is left are traces, and voices, and the way his story reflects the city that shaped him. So this will not be a story that ends with a neat answer. If you came here hoping for that, I should tell you now, before we both get too comfortable. Instead, think of this as a long, slow ride through the years, a night drive along familiar roads where I point out the places that mattered and share the stories I have heard. By the time we circle back to this kitchen table, you may still not know exactly what happened, but you will know the kind of man who stepped into that parking lot and vanished. If you are listening to this while the lights are low and the rest of the house has gone quiet, that is just about perfect. This is a story made for late hours, for the time of night when the mind is calm enough to wander without getting lost. You do not need to lean forward or sit on the edge of your seat. Just settle back, let your eyes grow heavy if they want to, and follow the thread as it unwinds. Maybe you have your own theory already. Almost everyone does, whether they admit it or not. Maybe you think it was a plan agreed to in some back booth, or a decision made in anger, or a fate that was sealed the moment Hoffa refused to step away from the power he had helped build. We will visit those possibilities in time, but not yet. Rushing to the end of a story like this is like skipping the slow part of a favorite song. You lose what makes it linger. We will start where most stories should start, not with the mystery at the end, but with the beginning. Before the headlines and the investigations, before the rumors and the folklore, there was simply a young man trying to make a living in hard times. To understand the force of the disappearance, you have to feel the weight of the life that came before it. So picture a different Detroit now, a younger city with smokestacks and factory whistles, with streets crowded not by office workers but by people in work boots and threadbare coats. Picture loading docks where men move crates in the freezing air while supervisors watch the clock more closely than they watch the people. Somewhere in that long line of workers there is a short, compact man with a stubborn set to his jaw. That is where our story will really begin. For tonight we will stay here just a little longer, at this table with the box between us. I push the clippings aside until I find a worn spiral notebook, the one where I tried to gather the loose facts into some kind of order, names, dates, places. Over time they started to look less like a list and more like a map, one that winds through union halls, courtrooms, roadside diners and small brick houses on quiet streets. On that map the lines are not just roads or railroad tracks, they are the paths of people's lives. A driver who started in the years when Hoffa was still climbing, a warehouse worker who swore things got better when the union came in, even if it also brought trouble around the edges, a clerk who filed paperwork in a regional office and learned that the real decisions were often made somewhere else entirely, over coffee or something stronger. I could keep this all to myself, the way some people keep a secret fishing spot or a favourite song. But stories are not meant to stay locked in boxes, and this os in particular has spent enough time buried. Tonight feels like the right night to open it up and let it breathe, gently and carefully, without judgment, without trying too hard to fix every missing piece. So let us open the old file, let us roll time backward, from this quiet kitchen to a chilly loading dock where a young Jimmy Hoffa first learns that a man alone has only so much power, but a crowd of working people standing together can change the shape of a day. The mystery can wait. Every good question deserves a long, patient lead-in. Chapter 2. Jimmy from the Loading Docks. The air on the loading dock was the sort that bites bare skin and seeps into thin gloves, that smelled of exhaust, cold metal, and the faint, sour trace of old produce that had spent too long in transit. Men moved with the slow determination of people who knew that hurrying would not shorten the shift by a single minute. Crates thudded onto hand trucks, pallets scraped across rough planks. Somewhere a supervisor checked his watch and frowned, as if the second hand were personally disappointing him. In the middle of that steady, uncomfortable rhythm, a young man with a compact frame and sharp eyes watched everything. He was not the tallest on the dock, not the strongest, and certainly not the calmest according to his bosses, but he had a way of paying attention that made up for a lot. He noticed who got the heaviest loads, who ducked away for extra breaks, and who came in early hoping to earn a little more. He also noticed how rarely any of that effort changed the pay in their envelopes. That young man was James Riddle Hoffa, known to almost everyone simply as Jimmy. He had grown up with hard work as the background music of his days. His family had bounced around more than once, chasing opportunity or at least escaping the lack of it. By the time he found himself working on those docks, he understood that nobody was coming to rescue a man who kept his head down and tried to be quiet. The Great Depression had taught that lesson in harsh detail. Jobs were scarce, money scarcer, and the people who did the hiring rarely worried about fairness. If a worker complained too loudly about pay or conditions, there was a line of desperate men outside the gate who would take his place. The message was simple: be grateful or be gone. Jimmy was grateful in his own way. He was grateful that his hands were strong and his legs steady. He was grateful that his mind could keep up with the numbers that moved through the warehouse, boxes in and boxes out, hours worked and hours unpaid. But he was not grateful enough to smile politely while the men who owned the place cut corners on safety and stretched schedules until they creaked. He watched older workers limp through the day with bad backs and bad knees, injuries that had never fully healed because healing would have meant staying home without pay. He listened to men cough their way through winter mornings, breathing air filled with dust and fumes. On payday he saw how thin the envelopes were, how quickly the money disappeared into rent, food, and the little extras families needed to feel like they were not just surviving but actually living. In that world, anger was common. So was resignation. Men cursed under their breath, kicked at pallets, and dreamed out loud about a winning horse or a lucky ticket. but after the shift ended, they went home, slept, and came back to do it again. The idea that anything could be different seemed almost childish. Jimmy, however, had a talent for seeing possibilities in crowded, noisy spaces. He noticed that the bosses were not nearly as strong when they faced a group as they were when they cornered an individual. A supervisor might threaten their man with being fired, but when 5 or 6 men spoke together, even the supervisor started to choose his words more carefully. The company could replace a single troublemaker. Replacing a whole crew would slow the flow of goods and anger the people higher up. He did not discover this in a single flash. It came in small moments, like tiny sparks. A worker refused to take on an unsafe load, and his friends quietly backed him up. Another man spoke out about pay being docked unfairly, and for once the supervisor grudgingly returned the lost money. Each time, Jimmy filed away the pattern. Together the men had power that none of them held alone. There was talk now and then of unions. The word floated through the dock like the smell of coffee from a distant pot. Some men spoke of it with hope, others with fear. The bosses clearly hated the idea. That alone told Jimmy there was something worth exploring. Anything that made management nervous was at least worth understanding. In those days, union organizers were not distant figures in suits. They were often workers themselves or neighbors or relatives. They came around quietly, spoke in back rooms, explained what it meant to sign a card, to attend a meeting, to stand up together. For the companies, this was almost a crime. For the workers, it was a cautious step toward feeling less alone. Jimmy listened to the organizers and then watched the faces of his fellow workers. Some looked skeptical, some were afraid of losing their jobs. A few looked suddenly taller, as if the very idea that they might have a collective voice straightened their spines. Jimmy saw himself in that last group. The more he learned, the more he felt as if someone had put a name to the restlessness that had been growing inside him. He started small. That was his way. He did not march out onto the dock and announce a revolution. Instead, he talked to men on their lunch breaks, in the narrow strip of shade by the building wall, over tin cups of coffee. He asked questions. Were they happy with their pay? Did they think the work was safe? Had they ever heard of another warehouse where conditions were better? He listened much more than he spoke. When he did speak, he had a knack for making the idea of standing together feel less like a risk and more like common sense. He pointed out logical bits. If 10 men refused to handle a stack of unstable crates, the supervisor could not fire all 10 without creating a crisis for the company. If everyone insisted on being paid for all the hours they worked, management would have to respond. The key, he said, was to act together, not one by why. Word spread that Jimmy was someone who could handle himself in a dispute. Not because he was the biggest man in the room, but because he refused to be intimidated. Supervisors learned that shouting did not easily shake him. He had a stubborn patience that could outlast anger. When they tried to corner him with tricky questions, he would respond with his own, forcing them to explain why a policy was the way it was. Often they could not. In time, small disputes turned into larger efforts. Workers in some warehouses refused to unload trucks until certain abuses were corrected. The first attempts were clumsy and not always successful. Men worried about their families, about rent, about food. Jimmy knew that a failure at the wrong moment could crush the fragile confidence they were building. He took care to choose battles where the men could win something, even if it was small. Those early victories mattered more than the size of the gains. A safer procedure here, a small raise there. The real prize was the feeling among the workers that their voices mattered. Jimmy saw that feeling take root and grow. Men who had spent years keeping their heads down now met his eye and spoke their minds. They started to see themselves not simply as replaceable parts, but as people whose labor gave the company its life. Along the way, he made friends, rivals, and a few quiet enemies. Not everyone liked a man who stirred the pot. Some workers feared change. Some liked private deals with supervisors that gave them small advantages over their fellows. Jimmy understood that organizing people meant stepping on toes, but he tried to avoid humiliating anyone. He preferred to bring people around slowly, one conversation at a time. Beyond the warehouse walls, power moved in less visible ways. There were people who controlled trucking routes and freight contracts with a handshake, people whose family names were spoken carefully, with a touch of respect and a hint of caution. As his organizing work drew more attention, some of those shadows began to notice him. A man who could move a group of workers was a man whose cooperation might be considered valuable. Jimmy was no innocent about this. You do not grow up in tough times without learning that power rarely comes with clean hands. He understood that alliances in the city could run from union halls to back rooms where the lights were low and the ashtrays full. He also understood that if workers were going to win better contracts, they would need leverage, and leverage often meant making deals with people whose motives were not purely noble. For now, though, his world was still mostly measured in shifts and pay envelopes, not court cases or national headlines. He moved through warehouses and meeting rooms with a quick, sure stride, always listening, always measuring the mood. He kept a mental list of who could be counted on in a vote, who might change their mind, and who would likely fold under pressure from management. As small local efforts turned into more formal organizing campaigns, Jimmy found himself in living rooms and church basements, explaining union basics to workers' spouses as well as the workers themselves. He knew that a man who feared his partner would disapprove was less likely to risk a strike or a confrontation. So he spoke plainly about what the union hoped to achieve: better pay, safer workplaces, a bit of security in old age when the body could no longer haul crates or drive long miles. He had a gift for making the concept of solidarity feel practical. This was not lofty, abstract talk, it was simple math. If one person stood alone, a company could shrug. If hundreds stood together, the company had to come to the table. Children might have shoes that lasted through winter. Elderly parents might afford heat. The details were ordinary and deeply human, the kind of things that occupy the minds of people whose main ambition is to live with a little dignity. With recognition came responsibility. Jimmy was drawn deeper into the structure of the union that had been growing in the trucking world, the Teamsters. At first, this meant more meetings, more negotiations, more long nights at folding tables strewn with papers. But it also meant seeing how local grievances connected to regional contracts, and how those contracts connected to larger questions about freight, shipping, and political influence. He studied in the rough classroom of experience. He read contracts, watched how seasoned leaders handled both allies and opponents, and learned where the real leverage points lay. It became clear to him that unions worked best when they were both tough and flexible, ready to stand firm on core needs, but also nimble enough to strike a deal when opportunity appeared. Of course, he also saw the less noble side. Any organization that controlled money and access to jobs attracted people who saw opportunity for themselves. Some leaders skimmed a little, some skimmed more than a little, some traded favors that had nothing to do with bettering the lives of the rank and file. Jimmy did not look away from this, but neither did he pretend that any large structure could be perfectly clean. He developed his own code, rough but consistent. Keep the members taken care of, keep the contracts improving. If that meant dealing with a few characters whose reputations would never pass a polite background check, he would at least make sure the workers got something real in return. To him, betrayal was not in shaking the wrong hand, but in letting the people on the dock pay the price for it without benefit. On the loading docks and in the warehouses, what people noticed most was that things were changing. Safety rules tightened. Pay edged upward. Men who once feared being fired for talking back now discovered that their complaints were heard, at least sometimes. There were still bad days, unfair decisions, and dangerous corners, but the feeling of total helplessness began to thin. Jimmy kept moving, rarely staying in one place for long. One morning he might be calming a group of angry drivers who had been given impossible schedules. That evening he might be in a small office, working through contract language with a tired lawyer and a pile of stale donuts. Along the way, he never forgot where he had started. He could still sling a crate with the best of them, and that mattered when he looked a worker in the eye and asked for trust. As he rose through the ranks of the Teamsters, his early years on the dock remained the foundation of his appeal. He was not a distant figure in a big office. He was one of them. a man who knew what it felt like to come home sore and worried about bills. That memory gave his voice a grounded weight when he stood in front of a crowd and argued for a course of action. Some nights, when the meetings were over and the streets quieted, he would walk alone for a while. The city lights painted reflections in puddles and threw long shadows between brick buildings. He had come a long way from that first chilly dock, but its lessons were still with him. Power came from people standing together. Deals mattered only if they protected the ones who did the actual work, and any rise in influence came with new kinds of danger. That is the Jimmy Hoffa we carry forward as our story continues. Not yet the national figure, not yet the face on magazine covers, not yet the subject of endless speculation. Just Jimmy from the docks, a man with cold hands, tired feet, and an idea that workers standing together could bend the shape of their days. From here, the road will curve upward into larger halls and louder fights. The crowds will grow, the money will increase, and the shadows at the edge of the stage will move closer. But in the quiet moments, in the late hours when he looked back, he would still remember those first crates, that first chill wind, that first time a group of workers said no together and discovered that the world did not end. Chapter 3: King of the Teamsters. By the time most people in America learned the name Jimmy Hoffa, he was no longer just Jimmy from the loading docks. He had climbed, step by determined step, through the thick maze of the Teamsters Union, from local organizer to regional power to something bigger than either. If you traced his path on a map, it would look like truck routes crossing the whole country, lines of influence drawn wherever freight moved and engines idled at loading bays. To understand what that meant, you need to picture the Teamsters at their height. This was not some small club with a dusty office and a lonely sign on the door. This was a union that reached into big cities and small towns, into ports, warehouses and truck stops. If you could buy it in a store, there was a good chance someone in the Teamsters chain had helped bring it there. Imagine a nighttime map of the United States, seen from high above. The highways glow faintly, lit by the steady movement of trucks. Every one of those trucks has a driver who wants decent pay, safe conditions, and a future where years of work do not end in poverty. The Teamsters were the structure that promised to fight for that, and at the top of that structure, for a crucial stretch of years, stood Jimmy Hoffa. He did not land there by charm alone, though he had plenty of that when he chose to use it. He got there by understanding that the union was only as strong as the contracts it won and the loyalty it kept. On the other hand, there were the companies, hard-nosed and money-minded, eager to keep wages contained and control firmly in their grip. Jimmy built his influence at the narrow point where those two worlds collided. Union conventions became his stage. Picture large hotel ballrooms with low ceilings, smoke curling toward the chandeliers, the murmur of hundreds of voices. Delegates from all over the country gathered with their grievances and their hopes, wearing suits that did not always fit comfortably over their working shoulders. There was grumbling about local leaders, arguments over who got which routes, worries about pensions. Into that restless room walked Hoffa. He was not the tallest man there. In fact, he was shorter than many of the drivers in the crowd. But when he took the microphone, people stopped talking. Part of it was his voice, clipped and sure, with a rhythm that made even complex contract terms sound like something you could hold in your hands. Part of it was the way he looked directly at people, one section at a time, as if he were speaking to each of them alone. He did not promise miracles. He promised fights. Longer, smarter, tougher bargaining sessions, wider coverage for pensions and healthcare, protection for drivers who refused to take trucks out in dangerous conditions. He talked about using the full weight of the union to bring companies back to the table when they tried to cut corners. Most of all, he talked about respect, not as a vague idea, but as something that should show up in paychecks and in the way managers spoke to workers. On the floor of those conventions, deals were made and deals were broken. Hoffa proved he understood that the union was not just an ideal. It was a living thing, full of factions, old grudges, and local loyalties. He wooed some rivals, outmaneuvered others, and made careful use of favors. If a local needed help during a tough strike, he found a way. If a delegate delivered votes when he needed them, he remembered that loyalty later. People who crossed him found that their calls did not get returned as quickly as before. Outside the union halls, company executives watched all this with deep concern. A union that acted as sun across multiple regions could shut down distribution in ways that cost real money. The more drivers Hoffa could rally, the more leverage he had to demand higher wages and better benefits. And as the Teamsters expanded their contracts, the size of pension funds and other investments grew accordingly. To the companies, Hoffa started to look less like a negotiator and more like a rival power center. In that environment, rumors were as common as exhaust fumes. Stories spread that certain local leaders had friends who did not work for any company or union, but who still knew how to make problems disappear. There were whispers about mob families who had discovered that unions could be useful tools, and that some union men discovered in turn that mob muscle could make life easier in tense disputes. The line between rumor and reality was sometimes hard to draw. There were restaurants and social clubs where men with union titles and men with reputations in organized crime sat at the same tables. They talked about loans, construction, trucking contracts, and other business that moved money in large amounts. To some, this was simply how the city worked. To others, it was a sign that something inside the labor movement had gone badly off track. Hoffa moved in that mixed world with a brisk confidence. He met with business leaders, political figures, and men whose names made federal agents sit up a little straighter. He did not advertise these connections, but he did not fully hide them either. In his mind, he was using every tool available to strengthen the union. If that meant dealing with tough characters, he believed he could control the relationship. At the same time, he cultivated a public image of relentless dedication to working people. When there was a strike line, he walked it. When a local was in trouble, he appeared, sometimes without warning, to rally the members and pressure the company. Drivers talked about seeing him in truck yards, jacket off, sleeves rolled, speaking with small groups late into the night. Whether every story was literally true hardly matters. The image of the tireless union man took root and grew. The Teamsters under Hoffa negotiated national freight agreements that tied together many separate operations into a single web. A driver in no state suddenly found his wages connected to standards set across several others. That kind of reach gave the union a voice that could not easily be ignored in politics either. Candidates seeking higher office discovered that a friendly word from Hoffa could open wallets and sway votes. Somewhere along the way, the image of the short man on a loading dock was replaced by the figure of a kingmaker. With greater visibility came more scrutiny. Journalists dug into the union books. Federal investigators tracked reports of missing funds, no-show jobs, and sweetheart contracts that seemed to benefit certain companies or individuals more than the rank and file. They followed trails that ran through Las Vegas casinos, construction projects, and businesses that seemed to exist mostly on paper. Inside the union, not everyone welcomed the spotlight. Some leaders worried that the public focus on corruption stories would weaken the union in the eyes of the country. Others resented that Hoffa seemed to be both the union's savior and its lightning rod, attracting credit and suspicion in equal measure. Old alliances cracked. Quiet resentments thickened in back rooms. Still, to many workers, none of that mattered as much as the numbers in their pay envelopes and the security promised in their pension plans. If Hoffa was dealing with people from the darker side of town, they told themselves, that was his business. Their business was to get a better life out of the bargain. And for a time, they did. Wages rose, benefits expanded. The union hall became a place where they felt at least someone was willing to fight on their behalf. In this tangle of expectations and obligations, Hoffa thrived. He loved the action, the meetings, the sense that he was at the center of a huge, humming machine. His schedule was crowded with conferences, speeches, and negotiations. He flew across the country, checking on locals, reinforcing his authority, smoothing or sharpening disputes as needed. Photographs from the period show him stepping off planes, flanked by aides, looking determined and right at home. But the same qualities that made him effective also made him stand out to people in government who had their own ideas about law and order. They saw in the Teamsters under Hoffa not just a powerful union, but a potential threat to the balance they wished to maintain. A group that could shut down trucking across regions, that controlled large sums of investment money, and that had rumored ties to organized crime, drew their attention like a bright flare against a night sky. You can imagine the feeling of inevitability that began to creep in. A man who climbed so far, who made deals with so many kinds of people, would sooner or later cross paths with those who believed it was their duty to bring him down. The streets outside union halls began to see more men in suits who did not look like company negotiators or drivers. They looked like federal agents, calm and patient, taking notes. The legend of Hoffa grew along two tracks at once. On one track he was the defender of working people, the man who stood up to corporations and delivered results. On the other, he was the figure that appeared in headlines about corruption, mob ties, and investigations. Depending on who you asked, he was a hero, a villain, or something in between. Most people, if they were honest, knew he was a mix of all three, because that is how real human beings usually are. For now, though, he was still firmly in command, the king of the Teamsters in all but official title. He walked into conventions to applause, banged the gavel to call meetings to order, and declared that the union would stay strong no matter who tried to weaken it. When asked about the accusations, he brushed them off with the certainty of a man who had weathered plenty of storms. Outside, in those quiet hours when trucks rolled through sleeping towns and drivers drank coffee at counters sticky with sugar, people talked about him the same way they might talk about the weather. Some days he was a bright sun that made things grow. Some days he was a gathering storm. Either way, he was hard to ignore. As you settle in deeper into this story, it is worth remembering that this chapter is not about saints or monsters. It is about a man who discovered he could move crowds and then stepped into a position where moving crowds carried heavy consequences. The same stubbornness that had once defended a few dozen workers on a dock now shaped the fortunes of hundreds of thousands. Soon enough, that stubbornness would collide with another kind of determination, one carried by government lawyers and a certain attorney general who saw in Jimmy Hoffa a test of their own resolve. The lights would shift from union halls to hearing rooms, from contract tables to witness tables. The king would find himself answering questions instead of asking them. For the moment, though, picture him where he felt most at ease, at the head of a long table in a smoky room, surrounded by aides, ashtrays, and stacks of paper. Drivers stand outside waiting for word. Company representatives eye him warily across the divide. He leans forward, hands flat on the polished wood, and says in a voice that brooks no argument that his people deserve better. In that instant, the long journey from the loading dock to the throne of the Teamsters feels completely natural. Chapter 4. The Long Arm of the Law. Power attracts attention. The more visible Jimmy Hoffa became, the more closely men in government suits watched him. In the halls of Washington and in field offices around the country, his name began to appear in files and conversations. To some officials, he represented everything they feared about union power. To others, he was a challenge they could not resist. There had been investigations of the Teamsters before, of course. Whenever large sums of money and valuable routes were involved, reporters and agents took an interest. But in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the focus sharpened. At the center of that focus stood a man who would become Hoffa's most persistent adversary, Robert Kennedy. Kennedy came from a very different world. Where Hoffa rose from docks and warehouses, Kennedy moved through private schools and political families. Yet both men shared a certain intensity, a refusal to let go once they had gripped a problem. When Kennedy set his sights on organized crime and corruption in unions, it was almost inevitable that his path would cross with Hoffa's in a way neither could ignore. The public first saw this clash play out in hearing rooms that looked, on television, like stages for a particularly serious play. Rows of senators sat behind long desks, papers stacked neatly or not so neatly before them. Witnesses faced a line of microphones and cameras. Spectators filled the back rows, leaning forward whenever a sharp question cut through the formal language. Hoffa was not the type to shrink in such a setting. When he appeared before these committees, he carried himself with a defiant calm. He wore suits that fit him well, hair neat, expression alert. He did not behave like a man grateful to be invited. He behaved like a man who knew he represented a large and important constituency and who had no intention of bowing to what he saw as political theatre. Television cameras adored this kind of tension. Viewers at home watched as Kennedy, sharp-voiced and relentless, pressed Hoffa on allegations of corruption, mob connections, and abuse of union funds. Hoffa responded with short, sometimes sarcastic answers, pushing back whenever he felt the questions were unfair or based on weak evidence. The exchanges crackled, not with shouting, but with mutual irritation. In living rooms across the country, opinions divided. Some viewers saw Kennedy as a crusader for justice, finally calling powerful union leaders to account. Others saw Hoffa as the man standing up for workers against a government that had never shown much concern for their bruised backs and empty pockets. Many people simply enjoyed the fierce back and forth, like a prize fight conducted with words instead of gloves. Behind the scenes, the work was less dramatic and more grinding. Investigator interviewed witnesses, reviewed financial records, and chased rumors across state lines. Informants from inside unions and from organized crime circles whispered stories of no-show jobs, skimming from pension funds, and deals that linked union support to business arrangements far from any loading dock. Hoffa, for his part, continued to run the union with the same energy he had always shown. He negotiated contracts, visited locals, and worked the political angles that kept his position secure. To him, the investigations were a distraction, a nuisance that he believed he could outlast. He had been challenged before and survived. He saw no reason this would be different. But the long arm of the law has its own stamina. Cases that looked thin at first grew thicker as more pieces were found. Prosecutors did not necessarily expect to catch Hoffa on the most sensational allegations. Instead, they looked carefully at smaller, more technical matters: jury tampering, misuse of pension funds, false statements, the sort of charges that might sound dry but could carry real prison time. Trials followed, each one another test of wills. Hoffa sat at defense tables in courtrooms across different cities, flanked by lawyers, facing witnesses who once had been allies or employees. Some testified in exchange for leniency in their own troubles, others claimed they were speaking out because they could no longer accept what they had seen. The juries listened, day after day, while the news media reported each twist like episodes in an ongoing drama. In some cases, Hoffa and his lawyers won. Charges were dismissed or juries could not agree. Each victory fed his sense that he was being persecuted, not prosecuted. He told supporters that the government wanted to break the power of the Teamsters and that he was merely the most convenient target. Many union members believed him. They saw the long process as harassment. Eventually, though, the tide shifted. In one case, prosecutors accused Hoffa of attempting to influence a jury in an earlier trial. In another, they focused on financial dealings involving a pension fund. These cases did not require proving that he was at the center of some grand criminal empire. They only required proving specific acts tied to dates and documents. That was hard enough, but it was within reach. When the guilty verdicts finally came, they landed with the heavy finality of a gavel strike in a silent room. For years, Hoffa had stood almost invincible, dodging accusations and returning to his work. Now a judge pronounced prison sentences, and the man who had once commanded conference halls had to listen like any other defendant. Appeals followed, of course. His lawyers fought to overturn the decisions, but the direction of the story was clear. The law had caught hold. The news rippled through union halls and truck stops. Some members were stunned, others shrugged and said it had always seemed likely. A few insisted the whole thing was a setup, and that Hoffa would soon be back in charge. Meanwhile, teams of officials began the slow, methodical process of preparing for his confinement. A leader who had lived in hotels and airplanes now faced a smaller, much more controlled world. The day he reported to federal prison did not have the drama of a movie scene. There were no slow-motion shots, no swelling music. There was simply a transfer of custody. A car door opening and closing, a gate clanking shut, a man handing over his personal items and receiving the standard clothing of an inmate. For someone who had built a life on controlling his surroundings, it must have felt like stepping into an airlock. Prison life is organized around rules, timetables, and the constant awareness that the same walls will still be there tomorrow. Inside, Hoffa was just another number in the system, with a bunk, a work assignment, and limited space to move. But he did not stop being Jimmy Hoffa simply because the door locked behind him. He read, he wrote letters, he stayed in contact with trusted allies. He tried, as far as the authorities would allow, to continue influencing union affairs from afar. Outside, the Teamsters faced their own challenge. With Hoffa behind bars, other leaders stepped into the spotlight. They presented themselves as capable stewards who would protect the contracts and the pensions, even as they navigated the troubled waters stirred by all the investigations. Some found comfort in the change, others watched closely, wondering whether the union would drift away from the fierce energy Hoffa had brought to it. For Hoffa, time inside moved both slowly and oddly fast. Days blurred into each other, but the world outside kept shifting. New political players emerged. The economy changed. In the union, rivalries deepened and alliances formed that would later prove crucial. He could sense these developments in letters and visits, but he could not fully control them. That lack of control might have been more punishing to him than the physical confinement. Still, he did not give up on the idea that he would one day return to his position at the top of the Teamsters. He spoke of it to supporters. He planned for it in his mind. The same stubbornness that had carried him from the docks to the presidency now turned itself toward a new goal: serve the time, get out, reclaim what had been taken. For the men and women on the ground, life went on. Trucks still rolled, loads still had to be delivered, and contracts still needed to be honored. Some drivers pinned news clippings about Hoffa on the walls of break rooms. Others quietly removed them, preferring not to dwell on the unsettled state of their leadership. But the story lingered in conversations, especially during late shifts, when the mind has time to wander. In Washington, some officials considered the case a success. They had shown that even a powerful union boss could be brought to trial and convicted. They hoped that this would send a message to others who might be tempted to blend legitimate labor power with darker dealings. Whether that message truly changed behavior is another question, but on paper, the scores looked clear. The law had done its work. From our distance, listening in the quiet of the night, the scene has a different feel. Here is a man who once commanded enormous influence, now walking the same corridors as everyone else in the institution, hearing the same keys jingle, eating the same meals. Whatever you think of his guilt or his choices, it is hard not to notice the human scale of it. A life that had expanded to the edges of a continent was suddenly reduced to the size of a cell. The story, of course, did not stop there. A twist was coming, in the form of political calculations made far above the prison yard. A decision would be made that opened the door earlier than expected, but with strings attached that Hoffa found nearly impossible to accept. That decision would set in motion the chain of events that eventually led him to a certain restaurant parking lot on a summer afternoon. Before we reach that point, take a moment to sit with this image. Jimmy Hoffa, once the king of the Teamsters, lying on a narrow prison bunk, staring at a ceiling that looks the same day after day. Somewhere in his mind he is already planning a comeback. Somewhere outside those walls, forces are moving that will shape his fate in ways he cannot yet see. You can almost hear the faint echo of truck engines in the distance, the reminder that the world of work he once tried to rule keeps turning without him. The long arm of the law has done its part. The long shadow of consequence is still catching up. Chapter 5: Freedom with Strings Attached. Prison records will tell you that Jimmy Hoffa left federal custody thanks to a formal decision, signed with careful strokes by a president and detailed in tidy legal language. Out here in the softer world of stories, it feels more like this. One day he woke up with the same walls, the same bunk, the same narrow window, and then word came down that someone far away had decided that his time inside was enough. Almost enough, anyway. The announcement came during the early years of a new decade, when the country itself was trying to decide what kind of future it wanted. A president from California, Richard Nixon, chose to commute Hoffa's sentence. The papers called it mercy, or politics, or both, depending on who was writing the headline. Hidden inside that decision was a quiet hook. Hoffa was not just being freed. He was being told to stay out of union leadership for a long stretch of years. On paper, the rule sounded simple. For a set period, Hoffa was barred from managing any labour organisation. In practice, it was complicated. The man had built his whole adult life around organising, bargaining, and directing the Teamsters. Telling him he could not do that was like telling a truck driver he could go anywhere he wanted, as long as it was on foot. But before we reach the protests and the lawsuits, picture the small human moment. A guard calling his name, a last count of belongings, a gate opening on a day that looked like any other. Hoffa stepping outside, a free man again, breathing air that was still filtered by fences, but that smelled less of soap and concrete and more of distance. He had aged inside those wars. Nowhere comes out of such a place untouched. His hair was thinner, his frame heavier, the lines around his eyes deeper, yet the set of his jaw had not softened. Reporters watching him walk out noted that he still moved with a purpose, as if he were already on his way to his next appointment. In a way, he was. He was heading straight into a new kind of battle, one that would take place not in courtroom witness boxes, but in union offices and living rooms. Outside, the world of the Teamsters had not frozen in his absence. Frank Fitzsimmons, a longtime ally who had stepped up as acting president and then president, now occupied the chair at the top of the union. He had grown comfortable there. Company heads and politicians had grown comfortable with him as well. He preferred a quieter style, less confrontational, more willing to smooth things over. To some, that felt like a welcome change. To others, it felt like a drift away from the fierce defence of the rank and file. When Hoffa looked at this new arrangement, he saw something that offended both his pride and his sense of how things should be. In his mind, the union still belonged to the vision he had championed, and to the members who had supported him. Prison time did not, in his view, erase that. The condition attached to his release felt like a trick, a way for his enemies to keep him out of the picture while pretending he had been treated fairly. He made no secret of his feelings. Once back among family, lawyers and loyalists, he talked about plans to return to power. The no management condition, he insisted, was not valid. He said he had not agreed to it, that it had been slipped into the process without proper consent. Legal challenges were prepared. His attorneys drafted filings that argued he should be free not in body, but in his right to participate fully in union life. From the outside, you could almost see two separate stories running at once. In Nen, a man who had paid his debt to society wanted to resume his place at the head of the table. In the other, a large union that had adjusted to new leadership was in no hurry to welcome back a figure who attracted government scrutiny like a magnet on a steel wall. Somewhere off stage, men with their own interests in the union's direction watched closely, ready to nudge events as needed. Fitzsimmons presented a calm public face. He visited the White House, shook hands with officials, and spoke of stability. Under his leadership, the Teamsters remained powerful, but some critics said they had grown more cozy with certain business interests and with organized crime families who valued a pliable partner. To those critics, the idea of Hoffa returning, with his stubborn streak and desire to assert control, threatened to upset profitable arrangements. Hoffa understood that he faced resistance not just from the government, but from within the union and from the shadowy figures who had found the new order more convenient. That knowledge did not slow him down. If anything, it stiffened his resolve. A man like him did not easily accept being told that his time had passed. He had seen too many comebacks on the docks and in the halls to believe his own story could not take the same turn. Meanwhile, life for him took on a strange double quality. On the one hand, he was a grandfather again, a husband back in his own home, a man who could wake up without the clanging of prison cells. On the other hand, he spent his days and nights turning over strategies for retaking his throne. His office became a hive of phone calls, meetings, and letters. Old allies were summoned. Wavering figures were coaxed. Rivals were measured and mapped. But some of the most important scenes of this period did not take place in union offices or law firms. They unfolded far from downtown, at a quieter place on Lake Orion in Michigan. There, the Hoffa family had a cottage that offered water, trees, and the kind of stillness that city streets do not know. The house sat close enough to the shore that the sound of waves on the lake could creep in through open windows on warm evenings. At that cottage, Jimmy Hoffa became, for stretches of time, not the union leader or the ex-convict, but simply a man surrounded by his wife, his children, and his grandchildren. The grandchildren remember him grilling food, correcting their manners, and taking an amused interest in their small dramas. He liked to appear in control of even the tiniest situation, whether it was a labour contract or who got the last piece of dessert. From the dock, the lake looked peaceful. Boats drifted past, neighbours waved from their own yards. Some of them knew exactly who lived in that house, others only knew that an older man with a strong voice seemed to host a steady stream of visitors. The contrast between the domestic calm and the undercurrents of tension made the place feel like a stage set for a play that shifted between gentle family scenes and backroom plotting. Because visitors did come, not just relatives and friends, but men who were reputed to have influence in worlds that did not issue press releases. The Giacalone brothers from Detroit, for instance, were seen at the cottage. Their names had already appeared more than once in federal files about organized crime. They were said to be offering help, to be acting as go-betweens who might smooth the conflict between Hoffa and another powerful Teamsters figure, Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, from New Jersey. Tony Pro was not a man known for his forgiving nature. He had a reputation as a tough enforcer, someone whose loyalty was prized by certain mob families. Once upon a time, he and Hoffa had been allies. Later their relationship had curdled into deep hostility, fueled by slights, disagreements over money, and changing alliances. That feud was a problem for people who wanted the Teamsters to remain predictable and useful. So the story that made its way to Hoffa at Lake Orion was something like that. If he could sit down with Tony Pro, if the bad blood between them could be reduced, then it might be possible to arrange a broader peace. That peace, in turn, might clear the way for some form of return to influence for Hoffa, or at least prevent open war within the Union from ruining carefully balanced arrangements. Around the cottage table, family members heard these plans and felt a mix of emotions. On the one hand, they knew their husband and father was not inclined to fear other men. He had long believed he could handle himself in any room, with any opponent. On the other hand, they also understood that the landscape had shifted while he was in prison. The men he sought to confront now held connections and resentments that ran deep. His son James had his own perspective. He admired his father's determination, yet he worried that the determination had become something sharper, a refusal to accept limits that might be necessary for survival. When he expressed concern, his father reportedly brushed it aside, insisting that he knew what he was doing, that he could look these men in the eye and come away with an understanding. Lawyers came and went, talking about appeal strategies and legal moves to challenge the restriction on union management. Hoffa studied documents with the same focus he had once given to contract clauses. But he also listened to the messages coming from the shadows. Some hinted that a quiet retirement would be safer. Others suggested that a partial compromise could be reached. None of this appealed to a man who had built his identity on taking the direct route through a problem. So the threads twisted together. A legal fight on one side, a political struggle within the Teamsters on another, and overlapping all of it, the subtle pressure of organized crime figures who worried that Hoffa's return would upset their influence. In the middle stood a man who refused to back down, even as he played cards at the cottage table with grandchildren who knew only that Grandpa Jimmy liked to win. Summer in Michigan brings long evenings. The light lingers on the water. The sound of insects hums at the edge of hearing. At the cottage, those evenings might have looked calm to a passer-by. Inside, however, conversations were going late into the night. Names were mentioned that carried weight in both union circles and mob circles. Plans were sketched, erased, and sketched again. It was during then of these stretches that talk began to focus on a specific idea. A face-to-face meeting with Tony Pro, arranged by the Giacalones, on neutral ground near Detroit. Such a meeting, Hoffa believed, could clear the air, re-establish his stature, and perhaps open a path back towards some measure of control in the Union. To those watching from the outside, the proposal had a different colour. It looked less like an opportunity and more like a risk. Still, Jimmy Hoffa was not a man who hid from such encounters. His whole life had been spent walking into rooms where tension hung in the air. He believed he could read people, bargain with them, and come out with a deal that suited his interests. The idea that he might be walking into something more final did not take firm hold in his mind, or if it did, he refused to show it. As summer ripened, the plan grew more solid. A date was suggested, a time, a place. These details began to move from the realm of rumour into the ink of calendars and notes. Hoffa, who had spent his life filling appointment books with meetings, added one more. A lunch with men who did not like him, arranged by men whose loyalties were at best divided. From the calm of our own seats, years later, it is hard not to feel a quiet shiver at the thought. A man under pressure from the government, opposed by new leaders in his own union, and entangled with mob figures, decides to attend a meeting that almost no one close to him truly wants. On the lake, the water keeps lapping at the shore. In the driveway, cars come and go. Inside, a calendar page waits to be turned. Chapter 6. A Meeting Nobody Wanted. There is something about a quiet house in the woods that makes important conversations sound even louder. At the Hoffa cottage on Lake Orion, the living room and kitchen had heard their share of family noise, of grandchildren laughing and dishes clinking. In the months leading up to the planned meeting, those rooms also heard voices, lowered in serious discussion, the kind of talk that leaves a trace in the air long after the words have faded. The plan for a sit-down between Jimmy Hoffa and Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano did not take shape all at once. It drifted in through visits and phone calls, wrapped in phrases like working things out and restoring harmony. The visitors presenting this plan were not official diplomats. They were men like Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone and his brother Vito, known around Detroit as figures with influence in organized crime circles and as supposed mediators in labor disputes. They would arrive at the cottage, dressed neatly, moving with the relaxed confidence of people who understand that their reputations travel ahead of them. Neighbors might see cars come and go, but most of the real business stayed inside. Over coffee at the kitchen table or in the quiet of the living room, they told Hoffa that they were trying to help. They said the feud with Tony Pro was bad for everyone, that a meeting could clear the air. Word of these visits did not stay entirely in the shadows. Family members saw and heard enough to form their own opinions. Hoffa's wife, Josephine, had lived alongside his battles for years. She knew that his world did not always draw a neat line between legal union work and the harsher games of the mob. She also knew that enemies who felt threatened rarely looked for gentle solutions. Some accounts say she urged caution, that she did not trust the men arranging the meeting. His son James, now grown and involved in union matters himself, felt a similar unease. He understood that his father wanted to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. He also understood that the men who now benefited from the new status quo had little incentive to welcome him back. When he questioned the wisdom of the meeting, Hoffa reportedly brushed off the concern, insisting that everything would be fine, that he could handle himself. From Hoffa's point of view, the proposed meeting probably looked like part risk, part opportunity. Risk because he knew full well that Tony Pro was not a patient man, and that the mob figures behind him were even less patient. Opportunity because a successful sit-down could reassert his strength, show that he was still a force to be reckoned with, and perhaps scare some of his opponents inside the Teamsters back into line. The men arranging the meeting spoke in calm tones. It would be at a restaurant in Bloomfield Township, the Mattress Red Fox, a place that served as a sort of middle ground between city and suburb. A daytime meeting, they said. Broad daylight, a public place, plenty of people around. The details were meant to sound reassuring. Bad things, people like to tell themselves, do not usually happen in full view of shoppers and office workers. Eventually, the talk moved from general outlines to specifics. A day near the end of July, a time in the early afternoon, Tony Pro and his associate, Anthony Briguglio, would attend. The Giacalones would play the role of escorts and guarantors. Hoffa listened, weighed, and agreed. In his personal calendar he wrote down the appointment. It was a small act, just ink on paper. but history would circle those words in red. Around this plan swirled other pressures. His legal challenges to the restrictions on his union activities were still grinding along. The current Teamsters leadership, centered around Frank Fitzsimmons, kept a wary distance. Some said that behind closed doors they wished Hoffa would simply fade away, perhaps retire quietly, perhaps move somewhere warmer and let the past be the past. That fantasy did not fit the man they were dealing with. For the mob figures who had grown comfortable with Fitzsimmons at the helm, the calculus was equally cold. A Hoffa comeback threatened hard-won access to pension funds, contracts and influence. They had seen his controlling nature up close. They understood that if he returned with a sense of having been wronged, he might not be inclined to share. In that light, a meeting to settle accounts took on a different meaning. Inside the family, the mood was mixed and tense. Daily routines still unfolded. Groceries were bought, meals were cooked. The grandchildren played and asked questions that had nothing to do with unions or mob families. Yet under those ordinary motions a worry hummed. People close to Hoffa sensed that he was walking closer and closer to an invisible line. He talked about the meeting as if it were one more item on a busy schedule. That was his way. He had spent decades treating high-stakes negotiations like everyday tasks, to keep others calm and to steady himself. He spoke of how he would lay out his case, how he would demand respect, how he would remind these men of past alliances and obligations. To him, the idea that they might be plotting something irreversible sat somewhere far in the background, like a distant storm cloud. In the days before the appointed date, small details fell into place. Hoffa told people where he would be and with whom. He mentioned the time. He gave enough information that, later, investigators would be able to reconstruct parts of his last day. At the time, that openness may have felt like another layer of protection. If everyone knew where he was going, then surely nothing too secretive could happen there. The Macchus Red Fox itself was the kind of place that did not look like the setting for a mystery. It was a family-style restaurant in a suburban shopping strip, with a parking lot that saw steady but unremarkable traffic. Office workers went there for lunch. Shoppers stopped in between errands. There was nothing in its brick walls or modest sign that suggested its name would become permanently linked to an unsolved disappearance. On the eve of the meeting, the cottage at Lake Orion settled into what looked, from the outside, like an ordinary evening. The lake lay dark and still under the fading sky. A few boats returned to their docks, hulls knocking gently against the wood. Inside, lights glowed through the windows. A television might have been on, casting moving shadows across the room. The smells of dinner and coffee hung in the air. Maybe there was a small talk about the next day. Maybe there was a reminder about what time he needed to leave, about which car he would take. Perhaps someone voiced more concern, and perhaps he met it with the same combination of confidence and impatience that had carried him through a lifetime of confrontations. Men who have spent years standing their ground do not usually admit fear easily, especially in front of those they love. Later, family members would replay that evening in their minds, searching for signs. Did he seem more distracted than usual? Did he stay up later, reading or making notes? Did he linger over goodnight farewells? Memory is a tricky thing. It reshapes itself under the weight of later knowledge. What once seemed ordinary can begin to look, in hindsight, like foreshadowing. For our purposes, sitting here with the story open in front of us, it is enough to imagine the scene in simple terms. A man in his early 60s, neither young nor yet truly old, moves around his lakeside home with the small authority of a person who likes things just so. His wife watches him, knowing his moods. His children and grandchildren, near or far, exist in the orbit of his choices. The next day, he will drive away with the expectation of returning in time to cook dinner. Somewhere beyond the lake, beyond the trees, in the neighborhoods and city streets of Detroit and its suburbs, other men are making their own plans. Their conversations are shorter, more guarded. They talk about routes, about timing, about who will be present and who will not. They are not interested in law books or union constitution. They are interested in control and in removing obstacles to that control. As night deepens over Michigan, the sound of insects rises and the cottage lights slowly go out. If this were a different kind of tale, one built for thrills rather than sleep, We might lean in close and try to guess exactly what thoughts went through Hoffa's mind as he closed his eyes. Did he feel a flicker of doubt? Did he rehearse arguments? Did he picture himself walking out of the restaurant triumphant? But this is a calmer kind of crime story, one that does not pretend to know what Noah can really know. We can only say that the pieces were in place. A man with something to prove, a union he wished to reclaim, mob figures who preferred the current arrangement, a feud with a former ally that had grown poisonous. A meeting point set in a suburban parking lot at midday. The stage is almost set now. When the sun rises on the next chapter of this story, Jimmy Hoffa will leave the quiet of Lake Orion and head toward Bloomfield Township, toward the matchless Red Fox, toward a moment that will shift him from history into legend. Those who loved him will remember that morning with a kind of double vision, both as the last time they saw him and as a scene they could not recognize as final until much later. For now, let the cottage slip back into darkness. Let the lake lie still. Somewhere in the house, a calendar shows a small note beside a date, written in a steady hand. A meeting that almost no one truly wanted, but that would happen anyway, waits just beyond the edge of the night. Chapter 7. The Day Jimmy Vanished. The last morning of July in the summer of 1975 began like so many others at the lake. The air was already warm by breakfast, heavy with that particular sweetness that hangs over Michigan water in midsummer. Light bounced off Lake Orion in soft ripples, slipping through the cottage windows and laying bright rectangles on the kitchen floor. Inside, the usual sounds of a family morning unfolded. A chair scraped back, a cupboard door closed. The clink of silverware on plates marked the rhythm of an ordinary day. Somewhere, a radio might have been murmuring the weather, low and forgettable. There was talk about small things, errands and phone calls and what to have for dinner. On the surface, nothing about this morning announced itself as final. Jimmy Hoffa moved through the house with his familiar sense of command. He checked his watch, made sure he had his wallet, his keys, whatever notes he wanted to bring. The plan in his mind was simple enough. A drive from the lake toward Bloomfield Township, a midday meeting at the matchless Red Fox restaurant with the men who were supposed to settle the long-running dispute, and then back home in time to grill steaks for dinner. He had said as much the night before. He would not be late. They would talk, they would straighten things out, and then he would be back at the cottage by late afternoon. It was the kind of promise men make to reassure their families when stepping into an uncertain day. He had made versions of that promise many times before, and had always managed to keep it. There are accounts that say he talked about the meeting that morning with a mix of irritation and determination. He was tired of delays, tired of excuses. In his view, if these men wanted a settlement, they should sit down face to face and hash it out. If they thought they could push him aside, he was going to show them that they were mistaken. The idea that he might be walking toward a trap did not fit the way he saw himself. He left the cottage late in the morning, slipping from the wooded quiet of Lake Orion back toward the suburban arteries that fed into Detroit. The drive to the matchless Red Fox was not especially long, the sort of trip a person can make so often that the curves in the road sink into muscle memory. Sunlight lay on the pavement. Traffic moved with weekday purpose, busy but not frantic. He stopped first at the office of his friend Louis Linteau, who ran a small trucking-related business. There, in that modest building, he checked the time again and spoke of the lunch as if it were just another appointment. Linteau later recalled that Hoffa seemed annoyed that the men he was supposed to meet had not been punctual in the past. He did not like being kept waiting, especially by people he did not fully trust. From that office, sometime near midday, he drove to the matchless Red Fox. The restaurant sat in a strip of shops and offices along a main road, the kind of place that blends into 1,000 similar scenes across the country. Its sign was simple. Its parking lot was ordinary asphalt, cut with painted lines and dotted with cars of various ages. Workers from nearby businesses came and went with briefcases and to-go bags. Hoffa parked his car and stepped out into the warmth of early afternoon. He wore a business suit, as usual, neat and proper. He checked his watch. The meeting was set for early afternoon, not long after the lunch rush. The people he expected, Tony Pro and his associate, were nowhere in sight. nor were the Giacalone brothers, who were supposed to act as the bridges between them. He waited. Time has a way of stretching when a man is alone with his thoughts in a parking lot. Cars pulled in and out. The restaurant door opened and closed, letting out small waves of air-conditioned coolness and the scent of food. Hoffa walked a bit, paced, looked around. The ordinary world kept moving. To most of the people there, he was just another man waiting for someone who was late. At some point he went to a payphone near the restaurant. This was before mobile phones, so if you wanted to nudge someone who was running behind, you had to step into a small glass or metal booth, feed coins into a slot, and trust the lines to carry your impatience. Hoffa called the home of Tony Jack Giacalone. A woman answered. I can't say that he demanded to know why the men were not there, that he said he had been waiting. He called his friend Linto as well, telling him that the others had not shown and that he was annoyed. In that call he said something that would later haunt everyone who loved him. He said he would wait a little longer, but that if they did not appear soon, he was going to leave. He also called home, telling his wife again that he would be back by late afternoon, that the steaks should be ready for the grill. Witnesses in the area noticed him. One saw him standing near his car, another walking near the restaurant sign. To them, he did not look particularly anxious, just a man waiting longer than he wanted to. They did not know, as they went about their errands, that they were seeing the last confirmed glimpses of him alive. At some point after those calls, things become less clear. There are reports that he was seen getting into a car with other men, a maroon-coloured vehicle, with at least one face he recognised from the Teamsters worlds. There are arguments about exactly who was in that car, about whether he got in willingly or reluctantly, about whether the witnesses truly remembered what they saw. What is certain is that after a particular moment in that afternoon, no one who loved him ever saw him again. The car, his car, remained in the parking lot. Inside were some personal items, his keys, and the sense of interruption that hangs in a place where someone clearly meant to return soon. The ordinary life of the restaurant went on. Meals were served. Checks were paid. Staff cleared tables and stacked chairs. Somewhere deep under those casual movements, the story of his disappearance had already begun, but no one knew it yet. Back at Lake Orion, time did what it always does on late summer afternoons. The sun eased downward. The light on the water shifted from bright to merrow. Boats returned to their docks. Inside the cottage, the day moved toward evening, and the promised dinner hour ticked closer. It was the sort of time when the smells of cooking usually began to drift through the rooms, but the man who had promised to be back for that dinner was not heading home. He was not on the road. He was not delayed behind some random traffic accident, not stuck in a long meeting at the restaurant. In whatever way it happened and in whatever place, someone had decided that he would not be allowed to come back. The details of that decision remain locked away, but its effect was brutally simple. Jimmy Hoffa had been made to vanish. At first, the absence felt like nothing more than annoyance, late again perhaps, held up by a conversation that went on too long. Maybe he had taken a detour to talk to someone else about union business. This had happened before. A day could slip sideways when a man whose life was full of meetings found damn more thing to talk about. As the minutes stretched into an hour and more, the mood shifted from irritation to unease. Phone calls were made. People who might have seen him were asked if they knew where he was. The answers did not fit together. No one had a clear picture of his day beyond that restaurant parking lot. The more questions were asked, the more the outline of a problem slowly appeared. His son James drove toward the Matchus Red Fox. The sun was sliding down, shadows stretching long across the pavement. In the lot he found his father's car sitting alone, a familiar shape in an unfamiliar situation. The car was locked. There was no sign of Jimmy. That sight snapped the vague worry into something sharper. Hoffa did not simply abandon his car. He did not wander off without calling. By that evening, the Hoffa family had contacted local police. A missing person report was filed. Officers listened to the account, took down the details, and started the slow, careful process of checking. Adults do not always vanish for sinister reasons. Sometimes they choose to disappear, to step away from their lives. The initial question was simple. Was this one of those cases, or was something else at work? The answer became clearer with each passing hour. There were no withdrawals from his bank accounts, no phone calls from him, no sightings beyond that afternoon. A man as well known as Jimmy Hoffa could not easily move around unnoticed. If he were hiding, word would likely have reached someone. Instead, there was only silence. News travelled fast once the story escaped the immediate circle of family and friends. A high-profile union leader, recently out of prison, with a long history of conflict and alleged mob connections, had gone missing from a suburban parking lot. That was the sort of line that editors loved. By the next day, headlines were already asking where he was. Television anchors spoke his name in solemn tones. In the cottage he had left behind, the absence took on a more intimate shape. A chair at the table sat empty. Personal items still lay where he had last put them. The calendar on the wall showed the date of the meeting, circled in a way that now felt ominous. His family moved through the rooms in a daze of calls and questions, clinging to small routines because there was nothing else they could control. The Federal Bureau of Investigation soon joined the search. Unsurprisingly, given Hoffa's history, his disappearance was never going to be treated as a simple missing person case. Agents interviewed the staff at the Matches Red Fox, the witnesses in the parking lot, the people who had spoken to him by phone that afternoon. They traced the steps of his last day, compressing them into timelines and charts. They learned what we have just walked through: the visit to Linto's office, the drive to the restaurant, the calls from the payphone, the wait in the parking lot, the final glimpses of him standing beside his car, the possible sighting of him entering another vehicle. After that, the trail went dark. In those first days, while agents compared notes and reporters sharpened their questions, the simplest truth remained the most painful. A man had left home promising to be back in time to put steaks on the grill. Somewhere between that promise and the dinner hour, he slipped into a gap that has never been fully closed. For all the investigations and theories that would follow, Jimmy Hoffa was just gone. When I leaf through the clippings from those early reports, the thing that stands out is how ordinary the setting appears in the photographs. There is the restaurant, its sign modest against the sky. There is the parking lot, paved and unremarkable. There are police cars and unmarked sedans, men in shirts and ties walking around with notepads. If you did not know, you might think a wallet had been stolen, or perhaps there had been a fender bender. That is part of what gives the story its quiet power. The final movements of a man whose life touched national politics and organized crime did not take place in some exotic hideout or on a distant road. They unfolded under the same blue sky that hangs over office parks and strip malls everywhere. On the far edge of that routine scene, a choice was made and carried out that turned him from a public figure into a permanent question mark. By the time the sun sank behind the trees that night, the cottage at Lake Orion had become something else. No longer but a family retreat, it was now a site of anxious waiting. Phones rang, voices whispered in the next room, children were shushed with extra gentleness. No one slept easily. The lake outside, indifferent to human drama, went on reflecting the stars. That is how the day ends here in our telling. With a car left in a parking lot, a family staring at a door that does not open, and a name that starts to shift from present tense to past in the minds of those who speak it. What happened in the gap between those last phone calls and the moment the trail went cold is still argued over in books and barrooms, yet the bare bones are unshakable. On a summer afternoon in suburban Michigan, Jimmy Hoffa stepped out of the world of ordinary facts and into the long, uncertain territory of legend. Chapter 8: The Search That Never Ends. The morning after a disappearance does not look that different from any other morning. Sunlight still pushes through curtains, coffee still brews, newspapers still land on driveways with soft thumps. Yet for the people closest to the missing, every detail feels strange, as if the world is pretending that nothing has changed. At the Hoffa cottage and in the family home, that first full day without news must have felt like walking through fog. The phone had already rung too many times during the night. Friends, union associates, reporters, and people with more dubious motives all wanted to know what was happening. There were no satisfying answers to give them. The only honest response was the simplest. He went out, and he did not come back. Local police had opened a case. Officers visited the restaurant again, talked with staff and customers, examined the parking lot, and looked for anything that might hint at where Hoffa had gone once he left his own car behind. They found curiosities, but nothing that broke the case open. The vehicle was intact. There were no signs of struggle that could be firmly pinned to him. No note, no clear clue. Within a short time, the Federal Bureau of Investigation formally entered the picture. Given Hoffa's status as a nationally known figure with a long record of legal trouble, mob rumors, and political connections, his disappearance was not just a local matter. Agents moved in, bringing with them the patient machinery of federal inquiry. They set up command posts, gathered reports, and started the steady work of turning every bit of information into a file. At first, hope clung to some corners of the story. Maybe he had been kidnapped for ransom. Maybe someone would call with demands, a sum of money, a promise of safety in exchange. It was a grim hope, but at least it suggested that he might still be alive somewhere, waiting. Families sometimes hold on to such possibilities even when the odds are thin. It is, in a way, less painful to imagine a negotiable crisis than a final act. No ransom call came, no credible communication from people claiming to hold him. Instead, what arrived were rumors. Rumors that he had been seen in a nearby town, stepping into a bar. Rumors that he had taken a plane under an assumed name. Rumors that he had been spirited away by allies to some secret location, perhaps for his own protection. The agents and police had to chase each one until it frayed and broke. The media attention was immediate and intense. Television crews filmed the front of the Matchus Red Fox, the empty parking space where his car had been, and the front doors of union offices and family homes. Reporters lined up outside news conferences to ask questions whose answer were always the same. What do you know? Where do you think he is? Who would have wanted to hurt him? Union members watched all this with a mix of worry and weary familiarity. Many of them had spent years hearing dark stories about deals gone wrong, about people who crossed certain lines and simply stopped being part of the visible world. That did not make it easier to believe that it might have happened to their former leader, but it meant the idea did not feel impossible. When you live and work in a space where unions and mob families sometimes overlap, you learn that disappearances can be a kind of sentence too. In the early weeks, investigators focused on the most obvious leads. They looked closely at the men who were supposed to meet Hoffa that day, Tony Pro and his associate, the Giacalone brothers. They examined alibi, travel records, phone logs. They talked with informants who moved in the same circles, asking pointed questions about late-night conversations and offhand remarks. Some informants, perhaps sensing opportunities to reduce their own legal troubles, spoke of plans to remove Hoffa from the picture. They used indirect language, avoiding the bluntest terms, but the meaning was clear enough. They suggested that certain mob figures saw him as an obstacle to their control over the Union, an obstacle that could be resolved only through permanent removal. These stories gave the investigators theories, but theories are not the same as proof. For a case to go to trial, let alone to secure convictions, you need more solid material. Witnesses willing to testify in court, physical evidence that can be presented to a jury, a chain of facts that holds together under cross-examination. In the Hoffa case, those pieces stubbornly refused to fall into place. Meanwhile, another type of search began to shape the public imagination: the search for his remains. Early tips claimed that he had been buried near the cottage or in some remote field, or under concrete at various construction sites. Later, more colourful ideas surfaced: a stadium, a particular farm, a chemical drum in some distant state. Every time someone whispered a new location, reporters perked up and investigators had to decide whether to dig. There were digs, backhoes tearing into frozen ground, crews scanning fields and wooded areas, dogs trained to detect human remains. Each new effort drew cameras, neighbours, and speculation. Each time the result was the same: nothing confirmed, no body, no clothing, no object that could definitively close the question of where he ended up. The family had to watch this cycle repeat, again and again over years. One week a news broadcast would show a search in progress, heavy equipment chewing at a seemingly random patch of earth. Commentators would say that this time sources felt confident. Then the search would end with nothing found and attention would drift away until the next rumour emerged. For those of us who study such stories from a distance, these repeated disappointments become lines in a timeline. For the family, each buy was a renewed stab of hope, followed by the same familiar drop, perhaps this time. No, not this time either. Their loved oak remained not just gone, but unlocated, unaccounted for in the most basic physical sense. Within the Teamsters, his disappearance changed the nature of internal politics. At first, there was public concern and calls for justice. Statements were issued, flags were lowered, but as time went on and the investigation stalled, the organisation settled more firmly under the leadership that had already taken hold during his imprisonment. Frank Fitzsimmons and those around him consolidated control. Some members felt that the union had lost a certain fierceness. Others believed that the new arrangement, however imperfect, at least kept the federal government from scrutinising them as intensely as they had under Hoffa. Whatever their private judgments, most drivers and warehouse workers still had to get up and go to work each day. Payrolls had to be met, contracts had to be honoured. The big drama at the top did not stop the smaller dramas of ordinary life. Investigator kept the case open year after year. Agents retired and were replaced by younger ones who inherited the thick folders and the thin set of hard facts. Theories shifted slightly as new informants offered new versions of old tales. Some claimed he was taken to New Jersey, others insisted he never left Michigan. A few even continued to float the idea that he had orchestrated his own disappearance, though there was little to support that beyond wishful thinking. In my box of clippings, the headlines march forward through the decades like a strange parade. Union leader still missing. New tip prompts search. Agents dig at Farn. They grow more cautious over time, the early confident tone replaced by a quiet admission that the case remained one of the most stubborn mysteries in modern American crime history. What strikes me reading through the interviews is the steady grief of the family. His son James especially spoke publicly about what he believed had happened. To him, the most likely explanation was that his father had been lured to the meeting and then handed over to men who unalived him on orders from mob figures threatened by his attempts to regain power. Without a body or charges, he could not prove this, but it is the story that made sense to him, the one that fit the patterns he had seen up close. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living with an unresolved loss. No funeral with certainty, no grave to visit. Every new search in a distant field or under a new slab of concrete reopens wounds. Closure remains a word used by reporters, not something truly available to those who were left behind. Still, life does what it always does. It moves forward, even when people feel stuck. The grandchildren grew up. The union evolved. Some of the men most strongly suspected of involvement in Hoffa's disappearance met their own ends, from illness or from sudden events that never saw courtroom resolutions. The world that had once revolved around his influence slowly drifted into the past. Yet the story stayed. In truck stops across the country, drivers still traded Hoffa theories over late-night coffee. In Detroit bars, old-timers would shake their heads and claim that they knew the real truth, or that they once heard something from someone who had been there. Documentary makers revisited the case every few years, walking the same parking lot, interviewing aging witnesses, and presenting new angles that often felt familiar. Law enforcement did not formally give up. Even decades later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation still officially listed the case as open. Agents continued to evaluate tips, though with a more skeptical lens. The files grew thicker. The certainty did not. Somewhere in those folders you can trace the arc from urgent investigation to long-term maintenance, the way a living case slowly turns into a historical puzzle. From my vantage point at this small kitchen table in Detroit, the weight of that long search feels less like a rush of action and more like a low, constant hum. It is background noise now, humming beneath other news. Every so often it rises in volume when a new search is announced. Then it settles back down, unresolved but still present. There is a lesson tucked into that hum if you care to hear it. In stories about crime and punishment, we often crave neat endings. The culprit is caught, the motives are fully revealed, the missing are found. Life, especially life lived at the frayed edges of power, does not always cooperate. Some acts are so carefully hidden or so efficiently carried out that they resist full exposure. Jimmy Hoffa moved in a world where labor, politics, and organized crime intersected. He built power in that space, used it, and made enemies there. When the balance shifted against him, it appears that those enemies chose a solution that erased him from the visible record. The search that followed was sincere, at least on the part of many of the agents and officers involved, yet it could not turn back time. It could not undo a choice that had been enforced with careful secrecy. At night, when I reread the old accounts, I sometimes imagine those first quiet hours after the news broke. The way truck radios must have crackled with the updates, the way drivers who had never met Hoffa still felt the impact of his name, the way families sat in front of televisions, seeing his face on the screen and realizing that, whatever they thought of him before, he was now something else, a man whose story would never quite end. The search continues in a softer way now, not only in files and maps but in the minds of people who find themselves drawn to unsolved mysteries. Writers, filmmakers, history buffs, insomniacs scrolling through late-night articles. All of them join the long line of those who ask the same question. What really happened? Where is here? We may never know in a way that satisfies every curiosity. The men who could have answered plainly did not choose to. Time has a way of closing mouths for good. What remains are echoes, patterns, and the lived consequences of his life and his absence. For his family, the consequences are personal. For the union he once led, they are woven into contracts, reputations, and the choices of later leaders. For the rest of us, they are wrapped up in the way we think about power, loyalty, and what happens when those two ideas collide. In the chapters still to come, we will step back from the investigative grind and look at how the legend of Jimmy Hoffa stretched beyond the crime reports into films, books, jokes, and late-night whispers. For now, let this part of the story rest where it is. A summer day in 1975 ended with a missing man and an unanswered question. Decades of searching have not changed that core fact. When you turn off the light tonight, somewhere far away there are still files marked with his name, resting in cabinets and digital archives. Somewhere in Michigan, the lake near his cottage still reflects the stars. The search, in one form or another, goes on, quiet, unfinished, and oddly gentle around the edges, like a question asked in a room where no one is quite awake enough to answer. Chapter 9. Myths, Movies, and Midnight Theories. By the time a mystery survives a few years without an answer, it begins to collect decorations. After a few decades, it starts to look like a fully decorated tree, every branch covered with shiny little theories and stories, some believable, some completely crooked, all of them hanging there whether you asked for them or not. The case of Jimmy Hoffa did not escape that fate. If anything, it became a prime example. Once the early investigation stalled and the first waves of searches turned up nothing, people began to fill the silence with imagination. Some of them were serious researchers combing through records and interviews. Others were barstool experts building entire explanations out of half a sentence they once overheard. Somewhere between those two groups sat the rest of us, listening and sorting. The simplest shape of the story was already cleared. A union leader with a long history of fights and alliances stepped into a suburban parking lot for a meeting that never really happened. He vanished from public view. The people with the most obvious motives for wanting him gone denied any involvement. The law could not prove what had happened. That gap, right in the center, became an open invitation. The first kind of myth to grow in that gap was geographical. People wanted to know where he had ended up, not in the moral sense, but in the very literal sense of where his body lay. It was not enough to say that he had been unalived and disposed of. The human mind prefers a specific location, something you can point at and say, here, this is where it happened, this is where it ended. So the suggestions came, one after another. Remote farms where the soil might hide anything, quiet patches of forest, construction sites where new concrete was poured over old secrets. Some pointed to places that had the right mix of seclusion and access to organized crime crews. Others seemed chosen mostly because they were famous in their own right, as if combining two well-known names made a more satisfying legend. One of the most talked-about ideas tied his fate to a sports stadium. For years, people joked in late-night shows that he rested under a particular end zone. The image was irresistible to a certain kind of storyteller. Each time a game was played, millions watched, never knowing that there might be a hidden grave under all that cheering. It was gruesome if you thought about it too hard, so most people did not. They just repeated the line and laughed. Investigator did not share the sense of humor. They had to treat even the wildest ideas with some level of seriousness. At one point, they oversaw tests beneath parts of that very stadium structure, looking for signs of disturbance. Nothing was found. The legend did not die. Myths have a way of ignoring new information if it does not suit them. Other theories kept the search closer to home. Some said he was buried near Detroit, in a patch of ground controlled by local mob families. Others shifted the scene to New Jersey, where Tony Pro and his associates had influence. Over the years, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and local agencies dug in both states, turning up plenty of dirt, but no trace of the man whose name had led them there. A second kind of myth was more personal. It revolved around confessions and near-confessions, the stories told by aging men who had spent their lives in the grey zones around organised crime. Some of them spoke to reporters, others spoke to authors. A few talked to law enforcement as part of larger arrangements. They all had versions of what happened after Jimmy Hoffa was last seen at the restaurant. In these stories, details changed like colours in shifting light. One man claimed he had been in the car that picked Hoffa up. Another insisted he had seen him in a house, still alive, still trying to talk his way out of trouble. Yet another said he had been part of the team that moved his remains, placing them in some hidden location that only a few would ever know. Each storyteller seemed confident. Each version disagreed with the others at key points. From a distance, reading through these accounts, you start to see patterns. Some men seemed to enjoy the attention, especially later in life, when the sharp edge of fear had dulled and they found a strange comfort in telling tales. Others might have been reshaping their memories, turning partial knowledge into full narratives, pushing their own role a little more toward the center. In a world where reputation matters, being the man who knows the truth about Jimmy Hoffa carries a certain dark prestige. Law enforcement evaluated these confessions with a practiced eye. Which details could be verified, which claims matched known evidence, which parts were obvious contradictions. In almost every case, the stories sagged under weight. Dates did not match, distances were wrong, supposed participants were proven to have been elsewhere. Once again, there was smoke but no clear fired. Then there were the cultural versions of the story, the ones made not in courtrooms or interrogation rooms but in film studios and writers' rooms. Directors and authors looked at the bare facts and saw an irresistible canvas. Power, loyalty, betrayal, a disappearing body. It was as if real life had handed them the outline of a classic crime drama and then refused to fill in the last act, forcing them to imagine their own endings. One film took Hoffa as its central character, building a tale that moved from his early days through his rise in the Union and onto a particular version of his last hours. It offered a dramatic explanation, complete with dimly lit rooms, tense conversations, and a final scene meant to close the circle. Viewers watched, knowing that they were seeing a mix of fact and invention. That did not stop the story from shaping the way many remembered him. Years later, another high-profile crime film folded the Hoffa mystery into a broader portrait of mid-century organized crime. In that telling, he appears as one figure among many, stubborn, forceful, and eventually doomed by the very qualities that had made him so effective. The director chose one of the existing theories as the basis for the final scenes, showing what might have happened behind closed doors. Again, audiences understood that this was not official history, but pictures on a screen are powerful things. They can easily feel more solid than old documents. Documentaries, television specials, and countless articles followed similar paths. A host would stand in the matchless Red Fox parking lot, or at the site where the restaurant once stood, outlining the known facts. Experts would appear in careful lighting to explain legal twists and mob connections. The program would end with a few competing theories, leaving the audience to decide which one felt most convincing. In these retellings, Hoffa himself sometimes changed shape as well. In some he was a tragic hero, a champion of working people brought down by corrupt forces he could not control. In others he was a dangerous operator, a man whose willingness to deal with mob figures eventually caught up with him. Most versions admitted that he was a blend of both, a complicated man who did real good and real harm in tangled proportions. For those of us who live in the city he called home, these portrayals add another layer to the way his name hangs in the air. It is one thing to hear stories from old drivers and union staff. It is another to see his life compressed into 2 hours of film, his mannerisms imitated by actors, his words reimagined by scriptwriters. Sometimes watching those scenes, I find myself murmuring that it was not quite like that, even if I was not there to see it firsthand. Yet I cannot pretend that I am immune to the appeal. There is a reason people stay up late reading about unsolved crime stories, a reason they click on yet another documentary promising new evidence. These stories offer a puzzle, but they also offer something else. They let us think about choices and consequences at a safe distance. We can contemplate the risks of mixing noble goals with murky alliances without having to live those risks ourselves. The myth-making around Hoffa also tells us something about what people want from a story. We do not just want to know that a man disappeared, we want a moral structure. Some want the tale to say that crime does not pay, that deals with dangerous partners end in ruin. Others want it to say that the powerful can never fully escape judgment, that even a union boss with mob ties is not untouchable. Still others prefer a story about loyalty gone wrong, about betrayal coming from those closest at hand. When you stack all the versions together, from confessions to films, the result is not a clean answer but a kind of chorus. Certain notes repeat, a sense that he was set up by people he once trusted, a belief that his body was hidden with ruthless care, a recognition that the official systems of justice were outmaneuvered by a smaller group of determined men. Beyond that, the chords vary. Late at night, when the city is quiet and the only sound is the occasional car sliding past my window, I sometimes imagine the different endings side by side. In Nen, he is tricked into entering a car and never leaves it alive. In another, he walks into a house believing he is in control and discovers too late that he is not. In yet another, he is passed from hand to hand, his fate decided far from his hearing. Each scene tries to put a face on the unknown, but the truth is we may have to make peace with not knowing which, if any, of those scenes is closest to reality. The men who carried out the plan, whatever the exact details, chose secrecy as carefully as they chose their actions. They wanted a disappearance, not a spectacle. They wanted a man erased, not a public example. In that limited sense, they achieved their goal. The lack of certainty is part of their legacy. The question that remains for the rest of us is what to do with the story as it is. Do we treat it as a campfire tale, told for shivers and entertainment? Do we treat it as a warning about the hazards of mixing legitimate power with criminal influence? Do we treat it as a portal into broader questions about labour, justice, and the way societies respond to concentrated influence? Maybe the most honest answer is that we do all of those things at once. We watch the films, we read the books, we shake our heads at the wildest theories and nod slowly at the ones that seem to fit the known facts. We accept that the truth is likely smaller and less cinematic than many versions suggest, but no less painful for that. In a way, the myths now say as much about us as they do about Jimmy Hoffa. They reveal our need for closure, our suspicion of powerful systems, our uneasy fascination with people who walk the tightrope between champion and villain. They also remind us that some stories resist tidy lines. Sometimes the best we can do is to listen, consider, and admit the limits of what can be known. As this chapter settles into your mind, think of all the voices layered over his name. Witnesses, informants, filmmakers, drivers, family members, investigators, insomniacs. Each adds a word or two, a stroke of colour. The picture will never be fully complete. Perhaps it is enough that the outline remains clear, and that we keep looking closely at how a man built his life, and how that life ended in a silence none of us can quite fill. In the final chapter, we will leave the courtroom files and television scripts behind, and return to the streets and highways where this story first took root. We will take a slow night drive through Detroit and its suburbs, passing the places where Jimmy Hoffa worked, fought, and finally disappeared. And then we will let the story rest where it must rest, in the space between memory and mystery. Chapter 10. Night Drive with a Missing Man. Some stories are best considered in motion, not in the blinding motion of daylight traffic, but in the softer flow of a night drive, when the city shows only a fraction of its face and the rest stays in shadow. On nights when sleep feels far away and the old box of clippings sits a little too heavily beside my chair, I sometimes take that drive in my mind. It begins in modern Detroit, a city that has been declared dead more than once and yet keeps breathing anyway. The skyscrapers downtown stand like quiet sentries. Some windows are lit, most are dark. The river lies beyond them, a dark band of water with scattered reflections. The roads that lead away from the centre are familiar, even if the storefronts have changed. New shops, old buildings, empty lots, all mixed together. I imagine starting the car and easing away from my block, the tyres humming over patched pavement. The dashboard glows faintly. The radio is turned low, more background than companion. I am not heading anywhere urgent. I am circling through the places where Jimmy Hoffa's story rose, collided with others, and then fell into silence. The first leg takes me past old union halls. Some are still active, still holding meetings about contracts and grievances. Others have gone dark, their signs faded, windows dusty. I picture the halls in their busy years, men in work jackets crowding in, cigarette smoke coiling toward the ceiling, the air thick with talk about routes, pay scales and grievances. Somewhere near the front, a stocky man in a suit stands on a platform and tells them he will fight for them. Further along I pass warehouses and freight yards. The exact sites where Hoffa once organised might be gone, replaced by newer structures or cleared entirely, but the work is the same. Trucks still back up to loading docks, forklifts still buzz, men and women still push through long shifts that leave their bodies tired and their minds half-numbed. Unions have changed, laws have changed, technology has changed, but pallets and paychecks remain stubbornly physical. As the car glides through these districts, I think about what Hoffa gave to that world. Better contracts, more secure pensions at least for a time, a sense among many workers that somebody important cared what happened to them. I also think about the cost, the deals made with people whose business model included threats and worse, the way pension funds and contracts were sometimes bent to serve interests far from the loading dock. It is easy to judge from a distance, harder when you imagine the choices as they appeared at the time, a company that refuses to move on wages, a mob figure who offers pressure in exchange for a slice, a politician who wants support and will trade favours, a leader trying to hold all of that together, believing he can keep the darker strands under control while directing the energy toward his members. It is a tightrope many have tried to walk. Few make it across. The road pulls me north now, toward the suburbs, toward the site where the mattress Red Fox once stood. The restaurant itself is gone, replaced by other tenants, other signage. Parking stripes have been repainted, different cars rest there now, offices and shops nearby have their own rhythms. Yet for those who know the story, the place carries a second identity, layered over the first like a faint watermark. I picture pulling into that lot at night, long after closing time. The lights from neighbouring businesses cast soft pools on the asphalt. A few lampposts push back the dark in small circles. Wind moves trash across the pavement. Somewhere, 20 or more car lengths from where I stop, there is a broad spot that matches the location in old photographs. The space where his car was found. It does not look like much. That is part of the point. This is not a haunted castle or a remote canyon. It is a piece of parking lot in a quiet suburb. If you did not know the history, you might think about nothing at all while you backed into the space and checked your phone. If you do know, you cannot help hearing a faint echo of a man checking his watch, making impatient calls from a payphone, waiting for people who never meant to show up. Sitting there in the idling car, I let the scene overlap. The present, empty and unremarkable. The past, crowded with invisible shapes. Hoffa pacing, strangers glancing over without interest. The small drama of lateness playing out, completely separate from the larger drama that would follow. It is an odd feeling, this double exposure. Ordinary ground carrying extraordinary weight. From there, the drive in my mind heads farther out, to the roads between Detroit and Lake Orion. The trees alongside the highway are taller now than they were in 1975. Subdivisions have spread into areas that used to be fields or forest. Gas stations and big box stores have replaced older roadside businesses. Still, in the curve of the road and the shape of the land, you can sense the path he drove on his last day. I imagine the cottage by the lake, lights off now, long since passed to other hands. The shoreline looks different in places, docks rebuilt, boats upgraded, but the water is the same water. It laps against the shore with the same small sounds it made the morning he left and did not come back. The lake does not hold on to the outcome. It simply reflects whatever sky happens to be above it. On this imaginary drive, I do not try to follow him beyond that parking lot. Other storytellers have done that, filling in the missing hours with their chosen theories. I am more interested in what his absence left behind, in the way a union changed course, in the way a family lived with both pride and loss, in the way a city carried his name forward, half in admiration and half in a wary reminder. A man like Hoffa is not easily sorted into the neat boxes people like to use. He was not only a hero of workers, nor only a corrupt boss entangled with criminals. He was a mix of both, and more besides. Ambitious, stubborn, sometimes generous, sometimes hard in ways that hurt even those who supported him. He stood up to corporate power, and he cut deals that helped mob families. He built security for many drivers and helped open doors for men who saw unions as a source of income rather than solidarity. It is tempting, especially in late-night reflection, to wish for a clean verdict, to say that he deserved what happened, or that he was purely a victim. But the more time I spend with the records and the stories, the more that kind of verdict feels false. Real lives rarely swing that cleanly between good and bad. They tangle, they contradict. In that sense, Jimmy Hoffa was entirely human. The one thing that does feel clear is that nobody deserves to be erased without a trace. Whatever wrongs he did, the manner of his leaving was designed not just to end his life, but to deny his loved ones the basic closure of knowing where he is. That denial still hangs over the story, sharpest for his family, dull but persistent for everyone else. Driving back toward the city in my mind, I pass newer landmarks, murals on brick walls, small businesses run by people who were not yet born when Hoffa vanished. Trucks still roll along the freeway, headlights in long lines carrying goods from one warehouse to another. Somewhere in those cabs, drivers glance at their pay stubs, think about their benefits, and wonder if the people who negotiate on their behalf are doing right by them. The question that animated Hoffa's career remained very much alive. In our time, there are new debates about unions, new scandals, new efforts to balance worker power against corporate demands. When someone brings up Hoffa in these conversations, it is often as a symbol. Sometimes he stands for what unions can achieve at their best. Sometimes he stands for the temptations that come with that power. His actual life, with all its complications, gets flattened into a reference point. That is one reason I keep that old box of clippings by my table. It is a way of resisting that flattening. Each article, each interview, each grainy photograph is a reminder that he was a whole person, not just a convenient emblem. A man with a family who loved him, a temper that sometimes burned too hot, a talent for organizing, and a set of alliances that ultimately grew too tangled to survive. As the night drive in my mind winds down, I picture pulling back into my own block. The engine ticks softly as it cools. Streetlights cast familiar shadows. A bus passes at the corner, mostly empty. Somewhere above, a neighbour leaves a television on, casting flickers of light into the dark. I sit for a moment before getting out, letting the stillness settle. In that stillness, the story of Jimmy Hoffa feels less like a crime puzzle and more like a long, troubling dream that the city has been having for years. A dream about power and loyalty, about the bargains people make to get things done, about how hard it is to keep your hands clean when you are reaching into dirty systems. A dream that ends not with an answer, but with a blank space. We are not required to solve that blank space tonight. The federal agents did not manage it in all their years with all their resources. The men who could have supplied the missing details chose not to. The rest of us are left with what we have. A life story that began on loading docks, spun through union halls and courtrooms, and ended in a parking lot with no clear trail beyond. What we can do is carry the story with a certain gentle honesty. We can admit the good he did and the harm he enabled. We can acknowledge the pain of his disappearance without pretending he was a simple figure. We can look at the world around us, at the new versions of old struggles, and try to learn something from the way his path twisted. When you finally turn out your light, if you have stayed with this story to its end, you may find that the mystery still tugs at you. That is all right. Some questions are meant to remain open. The point is not to solve them, but to sit with them long enough to understand why they matter. So let the roads empty in your mind. Let the parking lots return to simple asphalt. Let the union halls close their doors until the next meeting. Somewhere in the distance, a truck shifts gears and fades into the night. Jimmy Hoffa remains missing, but not forgotten. His story woven into the quiet fabric of this city and many others. We have reached the end of our night drive and the end of this telling. The rest is silence and the low hum of engines carrying new stories down the road.